The streets are filling up again, not just in one city, not just in one country, but across multiple continents simultaneously. What we're witnessing is something that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when the underlying economic and political conditions reach a breaking point that people can no longer ignore. Trump's reaction to these demonstrations tells us something crucial about the fragility of power structures right now. When leaders respond with heightened rhetoric and visible frustration to popular movements, it's often because they recognize that the legitimacy of existing arrangements is being questioned in fundamental ways. These protests aren't emerging from nowhere. They're connected to decades of wage stagnation, wealth concentration, and the hollowing out of democratic institutions that were supposed to represent ordinary people's interests. The timing matters enormously. We're living through a moment when the contradictions of the global economic system, the gap between those who own and those who work, between those who decide and those who endure the consequences, have become impossible to hide. Understanding why these movements are spreading means looking beyond the immediate triggers and examining the structural forces that have been building pressure for years. Let me take you through what's actually happening here, because the surface story, the one you'll see in most headlines, misses the deeper economic and political currents that explain why we're at this particular moment. When Trump responds to mass protests with the kind of language we've been seeing, when his statements become more aggressive and less measured, we need to understand this as more than just a personality trait or a communication style. This is about power recognizing that it's being challenged, and power rarely responds to such challenges with calm reflection. It responds with force, with rhetoric, with attempts to delegitimize and discredit those who are questioning the existing order. The protests themselves are spreading in ways that should make us pause and think carefully about what connects them. We're seeing demonstrations in Europe, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, and yes, here in the United States. The specific grievances might differ from place to place. In one country, it's about pension reforms. In another, it's about rising costs of living. In yet another, it's about authoritarianism or corruption. But underneath all these specific complaints is something much more fundamental. People are recognizing that the economic system we've been living under for the past 4 or 5 decades isn't working for them. It's working brilliantly for a small percentage at the top, but for the vast majority, it's producing stagnation, insecurity, and a future that looks worse than the past. This is where we need to talk about neoliberalism, because that's the framework that has shaped economic policy across most of the world since the 1980s. Neoliberalism promised that if we freed up markets, if we reduced regulations, if we privatized public services, if we made labor markets more flexible, which really means making it easier to fire people and harder for them to organize, then prosperity would trickle down to everyone. We were told that a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, we've had 4 decades to test that theory, and the results are in. The tide rose, all right, but it only lifted the yachts. The little boats, the ones that most people are trying to stay afloat in, they've been taking on water. The wealth statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In the United States, the top 1% now owns more wealth than the entire middle class. The gap between CEO compensation and worker wages has gone from about 30 to 1 in the 1970s to over 300 to 1 today. Meanwhile, real wages for average workers have barely budged in 50 years when you account for inflation. Young people are graduating with crushing student debt into an economy where stable, well-paying jobs are increasingly hard to find. Home ownership, once the cornerstone of middle-class life, is becoming a distant dream for millions. And this isn't just an American story. These same patterns are repeating across the developed world. So when people take to the streets, they're not doing it because they're irrational or because they've been manipulated by outside agitators, as those in power love to claim. They're doing it because the daily experience of their economic lives has become increasingly difficult, increasingly precarious, and increasingly at odds with the promises they've been hearing from political leaders. Trump represents a particular response to this crisis, one that attempts to channel the anger and frustration into nationalist and xenophobic directions. His message has been that the problem isn't the system itself, isn't capitalism, isn't the concentration of wealth and power. No, according to this narrative, The problem is immigrants, or China, or liberal elites, or the deep state. It's a deflection strategy, and it's a very old one. What's fascinating about this moment is that Trump's own policies have actually accelerated many of the trends that are driving people into the streets. The tax cuts that were passed during his previous administration overwhelmingly benefited corporations and the wealthy. The deregulation agenda made it easier for businesses to exploit workers and the environment. The attacks on labor unions weakened one of the few institutional mechanisms that working people have to fight for better wages and conditions. And the trade wars, despite all the rhetoric about bringing jobs back, mostly just created chaos and uncertainty that hurt workers while leaving the fundamental structure of global capitalism intact. Now, as protests spread, Trump's response reveals something important about the nature of authority in our time. Rather than addressing the underlying causes of discontent, rather than acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the economic system needs fundamental reform, the response is to double down on repression and rhetoric. We see this pattern repeated by leaders across the political spectrum in different countries. When people protest austerity measures, the response is more austerity plus police crackdowns. When people protest inequality, the response is to protect the wealth of the wealthy while criminalizing poverty. When people protest the destruction of democratic institutions, the response is further erosion of democratic rights. This brings us to a crucial question that doesn't get asked enough in mainstream political discourse. What is the purpose of an economic system? Is it to generate profit for those who own capital, or is it to meet the needs of the people who live within it? For most of human history, economies were understood as systems for producing and distributing the goods and services that people need to live. But under capitalism, and especially under the neoliberal version of capitalism that has dominated recent decades, the purpose of the economy has been redefined. Now, the primary goal is to maximize returns for shareholders and investors. Everything else, wages, working conditions, environmental sustainability, community stability, becomes secondary. The protests we're seeing represent a fundamental challenge to this reordering of priorities. People are saying, in effect, that they want an economy that serves them, not one that they're forced to serve. They want healthcare that doesn't bankrupt them. They want education that doesn't leave them in debt for decades. They want jobs that pay enough to live on with dignity. They want a planet that will be habitable for their children and grandchildren. These are not radical demands. They're actually quite reasonable and modest. But within the framework of contemporary capitalism, they're treated as impossible, as utopian, as economically unfeasible. This is where the analysis needs to go deeper, because we have to ask why these reasonable demands are considered impossible. The answer is that they conflict with the imperative to maximize profit, providing universal healthcare cuts into the profits of insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations. Canceling student debt would hurt the financial institutions that have made billions from the student loan system. Raising wages significantly reduces profit margins for employers. Serious action on climate change would require constraining the fossil fuel industry and fundamentally restructuring how we produce and consume energy. So we're told these things can't be done, not because they're technically impossible. We have the resources and technology to do all of them, but because they would require redistributing wealth and power in ways that those who currently hold wealth and power find unacceptable. Trump's angry response to the protests is really a response to this challenge to the existing distribution of wealth and power. He represents, despite his populist posturing, the interests of capital. His cabinet appointments, his policy priorities, his legislative agenda, all of these serve the wealthy and powerful. So when ordinary people rise up and demand something different, his response is to try to suppress and delegitimize that uprising. This is not unique to Trump. We saw similar responses from leaders across the political spectrum when Occupy Wall Street emerged, when the Arab Spring protests spread, when the Yellow Vest movement erupted in France, when massive demonstrations against austerity filled the streets of Greece and Spain and Portugal. What makes this current moment particularly significant is the simultaneity and the scale. These aren't isolated incidents anymore. They're part of a global pattern of resistance to an economic system that is clearly not working for the majority. And that simultaneity is important because it suggests that people in different countries, despite different languages and cultures and specific circumstances, are recognizing common causes. They're seeing that their struggles are connected, that the forces that are making life harder for workers in Ohio are related to the forces making life harder for workers in France or Brazil or South Korea. The economic system we're living under is inherently global. Capital moves across borders freely, seeking the highest returns. Corporations pit workers in different countries against each other, threatening to move production wherever labor is cheapest and regulations are weakest. Trade agreements are structured to protect investor rights, while offering little protection for worker rights or environmental standards. Financial speculation in one part of the world can trigger economic crises in completely different regions. So it makes sense that resistance to this system would also become global, that people would start recognizing their common interests across national boundaries. This is deeply threatening to established power structures, which rely heavily on nationalism and division to maintain control. If workers in different countries recognize that they have more in common with each other than with the capitalists in their own countries, if they start organizing and acting in solidarity across borders, that changes the political equation fundamentally. It becomes much harder to use the old divide and conquer strategies. It becomes much harder to blame immigrants or foreign countries for problems that are actually caused by how capitalism itself is structured. Trump's nationalism is a response to this threat. By insisting that the answer is to make America great again, by focusing anger on other countries and on migrants, he's trying to prevent the kind of international working-class solidarity that could actually challenge the system. And he's not alone in this. We see similar nationalist movements rising in many countries, all of them trying to channel economic frustration into xenophobia and militarism rather than into a critique of capitalism itself. But here's what those in power are discovering: nationalism and scapegoating only work for so long. Eventually, people notice that their lives aren't actually getting better. The promises that were made aren't being kept. The immigrants haven't been fully expelled, and yet the economy still isn't working for ordinary people. China hasn't been defeated in a trade war, and yet good jobs are still disappearing. The liberal elites haven't been completely silenced, and yet healthcare is still unaffordable, and student debt keeps growing. At some point, people start asking different questions. They start wondering whether maybe the problem isn't who we're being told it is. The protests spreading worldwide are evidence that more and more people are starting to ask those different questions. They're starting to see through the diversions and the scapegoating. They're starting to recognize that the system itself needs to change. This doesn't mean everyone in these protests has a fully developed alternative vision. Movements are messy and contain people with many different perspectives and goals. But the common thread is a rejection of the status quo, a refusal to accept that this is as good as it gets, an insistence that another world is possible. When Trump loses it in response to these protests, when his language becomes more extreme and his threats more dire, he's revealing the anxiety of a system that knows it's losing legitimacy. Legitimacy is crucial for any political and economic order. You can maintain power through force alone for a while, but it's expensive and unstable. It's much more efficient to maintain power through consent, through getting people to accept the existing arrangements as natural or necessary or beneficial. For decades, neoliberal capitalism maintained its legitimacy through a combination of promises and limited concessions. The promise was always that things would get better, that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you could have a decent life. And there were enough success stories, enough people who did manage to climb the ladder to make that promise credible. But that legitimacy is crumbling now because the promise has been broken too many times for too many people. The success stories are becoming rarer. The ladder is being pulled up, and people are noticing. They're comparing their lives to their parents' lives at the same age and recognizing that despite being more educated and working harder, they're actually worse off in many ways. That realization is politically explosive. It creates an opening for fundamental change, but it also creates danger because ruling elites will fight very hard to maintain their position. We're living through one of those historical moments when the old order is dying, but the new order hasn't yet been born. These are dangerous times, but also times of possibility. The protests spreading worldwide are symptoms of the death throes of the old system. But they're also potentially the birth pangs of something new. What that something new will be depends on how these movements develop, whether they can build lasting organizations and institutions, whether they can articulate clear alternatives and build broad coalitions, whether they can withstand the repression that will inevitably come. Trump's response to these protests is an indication that those who benefit from the current system recognize the threat. They're going to use every tool at their disposal: police violence, media manipulation, legal persecution, economic pressure, to try to crush these movements. They've done it before, and they'll do it again. But they're also afraid, and that fear is showing. The anger, the hyperbole, the increasingly desperate rhetoric, these are signs that power feels vulnerable. And when power feels vulnerable, that's when change becomes possible. That's when ordinary people have an opportunity to push for the kind of fundamental transformation that seemed impossible just a short time before.